Hello again, this is Melissa Cross with another presentation, this time about the overview and location and function of major brain regions. Alright, so we're going to start with the inside of the brain and work our way out. So we're going to start here with the brainstem. The brainstem actually consists of three parts: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. So we're going to start here at the bottom portion called the medulla oblongata. This is responsible for our breathing, our cardiac movement, and our vasomotory. So the contractions of our heart are mediated through this medulla oblongata. Being able to breathe, so the contractions and expansions of our lungs, that's all part to the medulla oblongata. Next, we're going to move up with the pons, and I'll draw a little arrow here. This is a relay system passing signals between the cerebrum and the cerebellum for voluntary movements. So the cerebrum is this bigger portion of the brain right here, and then we have this little portion, the cerebellum. So basically, that helps us with our voluntary movements. So if I'm going to move my arm, pick up a water bottle, bring it to my mouth, that is something I voluntarily did. That is all thanks to the pons. Next, we have the midbrain, which is right up here in green. So the midbrain is another relay system, but this time it's between the ears and the thalamus for hearing. It controls movement of the eyes and the head in response to visual stimuli, and this is where most of the cranial nerves originate. So if we were to see all the cranial nerves, they would be coming out of here and going around the brain, and some of them would be going down into the spinal cord. We can see some of the cranial nerves here off of the pons, off of the medulla oblongata, but most of them originate from the midbrain. Lastly, this is actually not part of the brainstem. This is a separate portion of the brain called the dicephalon. This is at the top of the brainstem right here, so I'll make it like that. This is called, again, the dicephalon. And this encompasses the thalamus, as seen in the picture, the hypothalamus, and the pineal glands. So the thalamus, right here at the top, acts as a switchboard between the cerebrum, again, this tiny brain right down here. It is important for things such as sleep and wakefulness, and it also relays information about sensory systems. So for example, if I put my hand on the hot burner on the stove, my thalamus is going to say, ouch, that hurts. So I remove my hand right away. The thalamus is also, the hypothalamus, which is below the thalamus, is responsible for maintenance and body temperature. This also regulates hormones, and this is the link between the endocrine system and the nervous system. This whole portion of the brain, so the brainstem and the dicephalon, is sometimes called the old brain because in evolution, this is the oldest and least evolved portion of the brain. So in organisms such as reptiles, this is the only portion of the brain that they have. And they don't even have the portion of the brain that regulates their body temperature, because they use ambient temperatures to regulate that, unlike us. So next we're going to go a little bit more inside the brain So again, we're going to go over some vocab. So this outer structure right here, this is called the cerebrum. The cerebrum is split into two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And in between those two hemispheres, there's something called the corpus callosum. So this corpus callosum splits the brain in half, and it is a patchwork of many fibers which allow these two hemispheres to communicate between each other. So unlike popular theory where we get, oh, we only use 10% of our brain, that's incorrect. Multiple parts of the brain are actually used for daily functions such as walking and talking, and the corpus callosum allows this to happen. Okay, now we're going to be moving outside. So this portion of the brain, all these colored regions, this is called the cerebrum. So these are the main major regions of the brain, and they are separated by a series of grooves and ridges. So these grooves are what are called sulci. So here I'm going to highlight some of the grooves for us. Right, these are the major grooves. And the ridges, these are called gyri. So let me use a different color. So these major ridges here, all these little folds. The reason I mention that is because the sulci are important for differentiating the different regions of the brain. So the two main ones that we need to know about are this lateral sulci and this central sulci. So obviously this breaks the brain into a bunch of different regions, and the first one we're going to be talking about is the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is responsible for voluntary motor function, motivation, aggression, and personality. A good example of the frontal lobe or damage in the frontal lobe is a man by the name of Phineas Gage. So he was a railroad worker, and he had a metal rod launched through his face, under his cheek, through the frontal lobe of his brain. Reports say that before the accident, Phineas Gage was a soft-spoken man, and after, he was loud and aggressive. So this again points to the aggression and personality aspect of the frontal lobe, and how damage to the frontal lobe could affect these portions. According to Hendry, the frontal lobe also contains a region of the brain called the Broca's region, and this is responsible for constructing sentences. So even though the temporal region, this pink region that we'll get to later, is responsible for speech, any damage to the frontal lobe will be characterized by a reduction in speech, incomprehensible language, and inappropriate words. Alright, the parietal lobe. So, the parietal lobe is this nice blue region, separated again by this lateral and central sulci. It receives and interprets sensations, so sensory perception, from the skin, muscle, and the viscera. This also explains how paralysis occurs in stroke patients and those who experience brain trauma in this portion of the brain. It is important to keep in mind that the right side of the brain, so again, like we talked about the two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and vice versa. So if a stroke patient is experiencing paralysis on the right side of their body, this is due to damage on the left side of the brain. Um, it makes sense that the parietal lobe would be located right here and deal with sensory perception, because this is right above the midbrain, and the dicephalon, which again is responsible for relaying messages to the sensory switchboard through those cranial nerves that we talked about. All right, next we have the temporal lobe. So this is this nice pink area here. The temporal lobe is responsible for hearing, memory, emotion, and language comprehension. So we mentioned that in this frontal lobe portion, we had the Broca region, which was responsible for constructing sentences. But the temporal region has an area called the Wernicke's area. This is responsible for language comprehension and vocabulary. So this portion is also sensory, the sensory switchboard for the brain, and it deals with our smell. It has the olfactory sensory portion, and it also has the hearing sensory portion. And again, form follows function. This makes sense. It's on the sides of our head where we would normally find our ears. Now the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe, this nice green portion, deals with our vision. So even though our eyes are right up here up front, our occipital lobe is at the way back of our brain. It deals with our vision. That's all it really does. Okay, then we have, lastly, we're going to talk about this little portion down here called the cerebellum. So the cerebellum actually means little brain in Latin, because it is similar in structure to the cerebrum. Again, this bigger portion, this is our cerebrum, and this is our cerebellum. So it's little brain, similar in structure to the cerebrum, hence its name, but it controls our posture, our balance, muscle tone, coordination, and also allows us to use fine motor skills through refinement of movement. So my ability to pick up a pen, write out my name, or pick up a fork and move it to my face to eat, those are our fine motor skills, all thanks to the cerebellum. And these are my references. Thank you for listening. Have a lovely day.